Hello, I'm G. I'm the gatherer. Our group has America from 1915 to 1925.
One of the main issues in the 1900s was women's rights, and it really started in the late 1840s, but it became more significant through the 1900s. Some of the main dates that were important was 1903, and that was the National Women's Trade Union League, and they tried to establish an advocate for wages for women or to improve it better, and we still deal with that today. And another important date was 1919, where Susan B. Anthony's women's suffrage amendment that she had first originally written was introduced to Congress in 1878, but it wasn't passed until 1919 by the House of Representatives. And in 1920 was when the 19th Amendment was actually added to the Constitution, and it granted the women the right to vote. Some of the opportunities that the women got from these women's rights, 23.6% of women composed the labor force during World War I, because the men were sent off to fight for the war, so the women were basically forced to go into industries or work on the farm and kind of replace them. And then after World War I, more jobs were available for women, like nursing or being a secretary. This was also the first generation of college-educated women because of this. And also the Women's Christian Temperance Union, they were bringing about a national prohibition, and it was basically just sinful for women to do that. And also the Equal Rights Amendment was first proposed in 1923, so it was later on. And some of the, influencers were Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Stanton, Amelia Earhart, and Gertrude Durrell, I don't know. And also, this just had women, they became more independent during this time era and focused more on themselves instead of their typical, cliche stereotype. And that was the women's rights.
So I got the lifestyle and culture of the 1915 through the 1925, and as with any other time period, the 1920s culture and lifestyle changed quite a bit, but it was affected by the social and political and economical changes of the time as well. One of the main things when we think about the culture and lifestyle in the 1920s is when we think about women. That's because there was a lot of changes that were happening with women in a lot of different areas. The women's rights movement led to the 19th Amendment, which gave us the right to vote. And also economically, women started to temporarily move into the workforce to take over jobs that were created after men went off to the World War I. Even though these were temporary jobs, it got women into more urban settings and out of the home and into society more often. Between the two changes, the women started seeing more equality with their rights and in society, which helped them progress, and we started seeing a new woman emerge within the 1920s, and it became what we think of women in the 1920s, which is the flappers and the flapper lifestyle. This lifestyle was a huge change over from the Victorian era Gibson girl look, where they wore the big dresses and pinned up their hair and had fresh faces. It moved more towards the looser fitting dresses, shorter hemlines. Women cut their hair off into short bobs instead of having it all pinned up nicely. And they started wearing makeup, which doesn't sound like a big thing, but back then makeup was only allowed in in prostitutes. And so when they started wearing it on an everyday basis, it was a big scandal and seen as promiscuous. The evidence of this in the flapper lifestyle shows that women were becoming more comfortable with their sexuality and becoming more independent. Because of this, we see that is also evident within other areas of the culture and lifestyle of that time period. Not only women, but men were becoming more laid back and less serious and taking on more of a party lifestyle. This came after, in World War I, after World War I, there was a little bit of a recession, but it was short-lived and there was an economic boom. Outside of, because of the economic boom, we had soldiers coming back and spending all their money, and they bought cars because those were coming off of the assembly line as fast as they could. And then also the invention of the radio happened, and with radio broadcasting and radio advertising, we saw more and more products becoming more and more improved and available to people, and once they heard it on the radio, they wanted to go out and buy it. So that led to men and women alike wanting to go spend their money, having more fun, and kind of living a crazier lifestyle than there was before. The government kind of tried to put a little damper on their party by introducing prohibition with the 18th Amendment and enforce it with the Volstead Act that happened with that. Prohibition banned all buying and selling of alcohol, so it shut down a lot of bars and distilleries and anything that was involved in the production of alcohol. But that didn't really stop anyone from drinking. They just found other ways to find the alcohol. Legal distilleries started popping up, and they were controlled by the mob. Before this, the Italian-American mafia still existed. They just had their hands in other things, such as drug rings and prostitution. But now, with Prohibition, it brought about the bootlegging business. It was found that within the 1920s, that the bootlegging business generated over $500 million in our current standard, which was a lot of money back then, and it was only within 10 years. But even though this was happening and all this organized crime was happening, it didn't go unnoticed. The police and the government knew about it, but there was a lot of corruption within the agencies. I read a statistic that said 10% of government officials had ties to the mafia during Prohibition. So 1 out of every 10 government officials knew about it, but was also being either aiding them or turning their cheek and letting them do their thing by getting money. But not only did the government profit from it, also the police profited greatly from Prohibition. The police funding increased by $11.4 million in this time, just during Prohibition, and it was great for them. So even though there was like this party lifestyle and progressive things and great things happened during the 20s, which have been sometimes categorized as the golden age, it was really more of a gilded age because it looked gold on the outside, but underneath it was corrupted and led to a huge crash.
Okay. Another thing that was happening in our time period was the Harlem Renaissance, and it was a flowering of African American art, literature, music, and culture in the United States, led primarily by the African American community based in Harlem, New York City. And it was an outpouring of creative expression that had been bottled up by the constraints of the segregation. The Harlem Renaissance was centered in the Harlem district of New York City. The New Negro movement was what it was called at the time. It had a major influence across the U.S. and even the world. The Harlem Renaissance helped to redefine how Americans and the world understood African American culture. It interrogated black and white cultures and marked the beginning of a black urban society. The Great Migration during the Harlem Renaissance, at the beginning of the period, particularly in the South, racism was rampant and economic opportunities were scarce. Causes of the migration were new farm machinery drove thousands of tenant farmers off the land, and in 1915, the severe fall weevil infestation caused the migration, and southern states had fewer schools and higher rates of illiteracy than northern states did. And northern states also had more cultural attractions and booming industries. The years between World War I and the Great Depression were the boom times, and a boom is a time of rapid, widespread expansion of economic opportunity during which jobs were plentiful. And they were in like cities, especially in the north. Why were they leaving the South? Between 1920 and 1930, almost 750,000 African Americans left the South for political, social, and economic reasons. And they went north for wider opportunities, for prosperity, and more racially tolerant environments, a sense of actual citizenship, and mass exodus from the South called the Great Migration. The North was a step up from the South, but it was no paradise. Segregation in housing and hiring were still the normal. Northern racism sometimes took on brutally. New arrivals could land only low-paying jobs like janitors, elevator operators, domestics, and unskilled laborers. Despite the challenges, most of those who went north never returned to the South. Why the Harlem Renaissance? Of the almost 750,000 African Americans who moved north, nearly 175,000 moved to Harlem. Harlem is a section of Manhattan which covers 3 square miles. Therefore, Harlem became the largest concentration of black people in the world. Triggers of the Harlem Renaissance were the end of World War I and the return of black veterans. Also, the formation of civil rights organizations and black solidarity movements. The ascendance of Harlem as the Negro capital of the world, and a new sense of economic, social, and cultural potential.
After the First World War, America experienced a massive economic boom with an increased demand for American goods and rapid industrial growth. The keys to America's boom were technology progress and increased consumer demand, which led to businesses making bigger profits. Industrial production doubled in the 20s, and America's gross national product grew from $78 billion to $103 billion. The number of people filing for income tax returns for earnings more than $1 million a year rose from 65 to 513. Jobs were easier to find and they were better paid than before. There is a clear link between prosperity and social change as well as social freedom. There were also 6 causes for the boom, and the first one was isolationism, which was the Republican government under President Harding and Coolidge, and they kept out of foreign affairs and limited foreign competition by imposing high import tariffs. The second one was technology. The third was mass production. The fourth was hire purchase, which allowed people to purchase new things such as vacuum cleaners, washing machines, and refrigerators. And borrowing increased the amount of money available to spend, therefore increasing the demand for these goods. Shares were also another cause for the boom. And the sixth one was Republican policies. And the policies of the Republican presidents was that government should leave the economy alone, which meant big businesses were free to expand without being held back by the government. The first president during the time was Harding, and he reduced taxes to give businesses more money to grow and to put more money in the pockets of ordinary Americans. And in 1922, he introduced the Foreign Tariff Act, which imposed taxes on goods from foreign countries, which made foreign goods more expensive. And so it encouraged Americans to only buy American goods. And the name for that policy was protectionism. And then after Harding, Coolidge came into office, and he basically had the same policies as Harding did. And then in 1929, Hoover came into office, and he enforced individualism, which meant that people shouldn't depend on the government for help, and they should solve their own problems by working harder. And then the people who benefited from the boom were owners of consumer good factories, assembly line workers, white people, speculators on the stock market, early immigrants, and middle-class women, along with builders. And the people who did not benefit from the boom were farmers, sharecroppers, African Americans, people in rural areas, coal miners, textile workers, and new immigrants.